Welcome, everyone, to our very own conversation with Tyler, as we call it. We're very delighted to have Dr. Tyler Cowen to join us for an Ask Me Anything. Again, like I said, we're very delighted to have him on. He hardly needs an introduction, but we're going to give him one anyway. Dr. Cowen, as you know, is a longtime professor here at Mason, and he has increasingly become the face of the department. He is the head of our in-house research center, the Mercatus Center, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. He's also grown quite popular as a Bloomberg opinion columnist, where he talks about many different issues and policy relevant issues that I know us undergrads have many conversations about. He also runs the economic education program, Marginal Revolution, with his colleague and fellow Mason professor, Alex Tabarrok. And of course, he hosts conversations with Tyler with many prominent guests, but we hope we can compete with some of them here. So Dr. Cowen, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. You forgot to mention the most important thing, though. I was also a GMU undergraduate.
Oh, that's right.
Yes, and we're actually going to touch on that in a moment. You know, you're famous from hailing from North Jersey, and as much as you talk about chess and how that shaped your formative years and your outlook on economics, how did the area you grew up in most profoundly shape you?
Well, for those of you who don't know, I was born in Hudson County, New Jersey, which is a working class county. And then my family moved to Bergen County, which is then and still is an upper middle class county. So I have a history in both worlds. I found that useful, but most importantly, I was always very close to New York City. No more than an hour's bus trip away, ever. So I went to New York a lot, went to art museums, most of all went to chess tournaments. A little later, I went to lectures at NYU, like I took a class with Lockman, got to know Kerzner, Rizzo, other Austrian economists there. And especially in the 1970s, to be near New York was such a big deal. Of course, there's no internet. New York was far more central then than it is today. So it just made all the difference. My father had been offered a job. I was just like a kid, young kid, like somewhere in the Dakotas, and he wanted to take it. And my mother put her foot down and said no. And that was one of the best things she ever did for me.
Wow.
That was a wise choice.
Yes.
And I love the Dakotas, to be clear, but I wanted to grow up next to New York City, and I did.
That's amazing. You touched on it before, you were an avid chess player growing up. How do you think chess shaped your analytical mind, like with your approach to different facets of intellectual issues that you cover?
Well, I played chess fairly young. So I was 10, and say by 12, I was really quite good. By 15, I was very good. And I sometimes say there are two main lessons in chess for young people. First is that, A, you can win. So you develop confidence, at least if you have any talent. So if you're regularly beating older people, at some point you start thinking like, hey, I can do other things too. And like, I'll have a chance. And to get that dose of confidence when you're like 11, 12, I think it's worth a great deal. And it carries with you for the rest of your life. Like, hey, I can do this. Because at the time I was always encouraged to play in kids tournaments. And I was like, expletive deleted, I wanted to play the adults. But the other great lesson of chess is that you can lose. So you can be good and you lose. You don't really have that many excuses. So you learn how to take honest feedback. And again, it doesn't matter how good you are, even the best of players are going to lose a fair amount. So just winning and losing as fairly objective metrics, you learn pretty quickly. And it's different than athletics. Like I played in Little League. I was like, okay, but not really good. But it was sort of removed from my ego to a considerable extent. If I like hit a triple, I never thought, oh, this means like I can do something else. If I, dropped a fly ball, I wasn't happy, but it wasn't like, oh, I can't like become a doctor now. But chess, maybe somewhat arbitrarily, it's completely mental and you think it's tied into how you'll do on other things.
Speaking of decision making, what's the ego aside, what's the the worst self-inflicted mistake you've made?
You mean in my whole life?
Well, just early on, or early on, it could be your whole life. It's just something that stuck out to you in growing up, that really shaped you for many years afterwards.
I mean, I've had a pretty boring life. So, like a really big mistake. Like when I went to GMU to be an undergraduate, everyone I knew, almost everyone, thought that was this huge mistake and that I should have gone to a more like traditional liberal arts or Ivy League school. I don't think it turned out to be a huge mistake. But look, I don't see the other path. So any like sane person would say that was some kind of big mistake. But I think it gave me sort of like time to develop in some fundamental way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh,
sorry, go ahead.
Oh, sure. Kind of building off that, what do you think led you like to not seek maybe the prestige of an Ivy League like institution as like a conventional, popular economist or any intellectual really would? Like what about George Mason was like, nah, I got to go here and this is right for me?
Well, I like the economics programs a great deal, but the actual truth of it is in a way far stupider than that. Though again, I don't regret it. But the notion that I would have to go to any school and suffer the indignities of living in a dorm with the noise, the parties, the alcohol, the smoking, the whatever, that seemed to me so intolerable. I just felt it would like destroy me. And I couldn't stand the idea. Whereas the notion that I would be a human being living in an apartment, having a car, having kind of a life. I roomed with Dan Klein back then, I might add, who is on our faculty now. That was great. I loved having Dan as a roommate. To me, that was just like such a better life. And I guess maybe I didn't have a very long time horizon. I was like, how can I say no to this life compared to that life? And I did it.
You know, with that being said, you seem to know at a young age how to navigate, not only the analytics of chess, but how to navigate people and how to gravitate towards better people and speak your mind, but also remain likable. And you've remained very likable throughout your entire career. Do you have any tips on that? Do you have any advice on remaining likable when you're taking such intellectual risks?
Well, first, I'm not convinced how likable I've remained. I know it's not for me to say. But second, I'm not sure you should be striving to remain likable. So there's a tendency to like tear down people who are successful. So, someone like Malcolm Gladwell, and I'm a big admirer of Malcolm Gladwell, but it's remarkable how much criticism of him there is in the public sphere. And I don't completely see why. He's not partisan. He's not spreading some kind of noxious message of hate, quite the contrary. He's super talented, and yet he's just like drenched in all these attacks. So to some extent, success, people polarize their feelings about you. And I don't know, I guess it's my fail, to whatever extent I'm still likable, partly I view that as my failure. I don't know.
Speaking of figures that have kind of polarized people and maybe have not remained likable and certainly didn't strive to be likable, this question comes from one of our fellow students, Jacob. Do you have any good stories about the late Dr. Williams, about Dr. Williams?
Well, I took his class. I think the year must have been 1982. It was a PhD class, but I was an undergraduate. And I asked him if I could sit in on it. I didn't take the test for credit. It wouldn't have been possible then, or now, I think. And he let me come. I was very, grateful that he did that. And I feel he always took me seriously, even though he didn't know me. That's very much to his credit. Every lecture was hilarious. And he just had what you'd have to call a unique style, which I imbibed. I mean, my style is very different from his, and my worldview is in some ways quite different from his. But just to get, the Walter Williams show at the age of like, I guess 18, 19, I don't know, 19, I'm very happy I could do it. And Walter, in class, he was very politically incorrect. I don't want to repeat everything that he said, but it wasn't like now. And I assume now, until he passed away, he was not that different. But it was really a very different experience.
How has a particular long-held belief that you've had been recently shaped?
You mean changed?
Changed, sorry, been reshaped. I meant to say.
I did a post on part of this about a week ago, and two things where clearly I was wrong. When Bitcoin came out, I first said it was a bubble, at least once it started having any price at all. Like when it very first came out, I actually blogged it. I was one of the first people to report on it. I'm like, gee, this is cool. This is interesting. I didn't know what to make of it, but it hardly had any value. I didn't call it a bubble. And then it got what then seemed pricey. Now it would be absurdly cheap. And I thought, oh, this is a bubble. Paul Krugman said it was a bubble. I thought Krugman was right. And looking back, I think obviously I was wrong. So that's something I've changed my mind about. I'm still not sure what to make of the whole phenomenon. And another claim I made, which I've been wrong about for a while, but I thought in the 2011 crisis, Greece and possibly Italy would have to leave the Eurozone. I mean, that's just flat out wrong as a prediction. And another thing, I had an argument with Brian Kaplan, and I'm mostly wrong about this, though I would say it's not completely over, but I thought marijuana legalization would never arrive. Now, it's still illegal at the federal level, so technically I'm not wrong yet. But I think the chance I'm proven wrong is pretty high. And up until like 2-3 years ago, I still thought I was right, though the belief was shaken a bit as each step toward legalization occurred. So that would be another area. Again, I can't quite say I've been proven wrong, but quite probably I'm wrong. And I felt pretty convinced at the time.
Speaking of like public policy issues, I know in a recent column you talked about like how important it is for the government now to like prioritize public investment over like consumption-based spending. What public investments do you think are appropriate like in this current state?
Well, just to be clear, the thing I wrote was, I'm a libertarian. I probably want less government spending than you, my readers, do.
Right.
But whatever spending you want to do it on investment. So I'm genuinely unsure what the level should be, but I would prioritize what is called green energy. I do think our government should be active there, and then protection against the next pandemic. So those are areas, I'm not even sure what the word libertarian means anymore, but it's fair enough to say by many people's standards, I'm both less libertarian than they are and less libertarian than I used to be. 30 years ago, I just didn't have climate change on my radar screen as a problem. I wasn't ever a denialist. It just didn't occur to me that there was some need to do something major about it. And now I clearly think there is. I'm very pro-nuclear. I favor market innovation over big government projects whenever possible, but I don't think the role of the government here can be zero.
Sorry, we have a question from one of our fellow executive board members from the club. He actually lives in Austin, Texas, so he's been dealing with the recent crisis down there. He says, as a native Texan, I'm privy to the current energy crisis, demolishing the state's will. We're currently facing a classic shortage problem where historically low temperatures have led to record high energy demand. Simultaneously, these low temperatures have knocked much of Texas's power generation abilities off the grid, leading to a multifaceted shortage problem. Many have been pointing fingers, and subsidization has created a disincentive to invest in more reliable energy methods. What economic analysis are you able to provide to this current situation in theory, and what policy proposals do you have to prevent shortages from happening in the future in Texas?
I've read about a dozen articles on what happened in Texas, all recent, of course. I still don't feel I understand it very well. We are at Mercatus trying to work up a project to have someone write about it and figure out everything you're asking. At the moment, I genuinely don't know. So just offhand, these are spurts of ideas, not things I hold with conviction. It seems it would be nice if there were a way Texas could buy insurance from other states without being subject to federal regulation of its grid. It's also worth looking at El Paso, which had a big cold spell, but didn't have any of these problems. They, in fact, did various upgrades to their system. I cannot tell you what were the institutional preconditions in El Paso that were different, but it seems to me that is worth studying. I get the point that higher prices, as in most economic issues, can be a big part of solving the problem. But that said, I also see it's politically difficult, like these people who are getting $17,000 electric bills. I mean, that's probably efficient in the economic sense, but I also strongly suspect it is not a sustainable way to run a deregulated system. And so incentives for higher investment in capacity seem important. I don't know what is the best way to do those or why those incentives were not there in the first place. Those are some of the questions I'm hoping other people working on this will look into.
Speaking of capacity, I know a couple of Mercatus researchers and fellow colleagues of yours, Noel Johnson and Mark Koyama, kind of do research on like state capacity and how it can be conducive to liberty. What do you think about that? About like the role of state capacity, and could it promote like maybe libertarian values? Even though, like you said, you're not sure what libertarian means anymore.
Well, I wrote this blog post on January 1st of 2020 on state capacity libertarianism. It might be the most widely read blog post I've ever written. But it seems to me there's a notion of wanting the state to be able to do a number of things, like run Operation Warp Speed, or just protect your country against foreign aggressors, that are quite important for the stability of capitalism. And the idea that you favor some state activism, but basically to shore up capitalism rather than to rein it in. Again, I'm not sure how libertarian it is. I called it state capacity libertarianism tongue in cheek, and everyone just calls it that now. I mean, that's okay. That's their decision. So, the book by Mark and Noel you mentioned, I did a whole podcast with them about the book. So that's a kind of demonstrated preference indicator that I really like it. I did like 45 minutes with each one. So there's a written record online of all the different questions and comments I had on it. That was a fresher take on it than anything I could give you now, but I'm a big fan. Brian Kaplan has been more critical. You can Google to his blog posts on this. He thinks it's a matter of political will, not state capacity, to oversimplify his view.
And countries like Taiwan and South Korea had been mentioned in reference to something like this, and the fact that we value privacy so much more, and how that would serve as an impediment to state capacity in ways that many people would disagree on. Have you?
I take that point very seriously, and I mostly agree with it. So I've never been pushing so much for what's called test and trace. I'm all for testing for COVID or other possible contagious diseases, but I don't think America will anytime soon be well suited for a lot of tracing. It's just not what we're good at and not willing to culturally accept. You might even think that's a flaw in our national character, but the flaw is not going to go away like over the next year. So I would say deal with that. That makes me see it as all the more important to have a good response on the vaccine side, which includes government subsidies, to be clear. So I've been a big supporter of Operation Warp Speed. Test and trace, I'm like gung-ho on the testing. I don't mind people trying to trace, but I kind of write it off as we're never going to be good at that for privacy and other reasons, just chaos reasons, people living in the middle of nowhere reasons, spirit of independence reasons. So I take that very seriously. Every nation has to find what you might call its own version of state capacity libertarianism. But if you're South Korean or Singaporean, I mean, they've done pretty good jobs with trace. I would recognize that as well. And I'm not sure how much people mind that, but I strongly suspect they mind it less than Americans would mind the same.
Hmm. Yeah, you talk about like all these issues like with COVID now. I know, little segue, one of the big issues is like, especially with our government, is how much, stimulus they're putting out there, whether it be, fiscally and monetarily. And I know those two things have kind of merged with the Fed kind of like engaging in like fiscal policy of loans. I don't know you've written on this topic, but why have we not begun to see an inflation in prices? And do you think that we will see any major inflation as a result of this?
I do not think we will see major price inflation. I think we'll see some of it. But here's the thing, the Biden stimulus, which in my opinion is way too large, but it's a one-time event. And people will not expect that we do the same like for 5, 10 years running. So I don't think inflationary expectations will be built up. I think a lot of suppliers will see higher demand and not raise their prices. They'll just ration. So particular restaurants or particular flights or tickets to Disney World, there might be a real crush to do those things once some more people are vaccinated. And rather than seeing inflation, we'll see queuing. You could call that a kind of inflation, but just like the measured rate of price increase, while I think it will be higher, I don't expect it to be out of control.
I was listening to that really great Weinstein interview that you did on his show, The Portal, and you guys had talked about the concept of feminization in society, dwindling fertility rates, lack of religiosity, and the state of male outcomes in America. Why aren't things like that talked about enough across disciplines? Why aren't they brought into the forefront of discussion as much, and why aren't they dealt with objectively? The state of male outcomes and health in America is pretty grim these days if you really look at it.
Well, I think it's talked about a lot, but you have to give it all a very particular framing, or you run some risk of being canceled. So you can talk about like the pathologies of Trump voters or something, and sort of make some related points, but it's all framed, sort of the good evil narrative is all slanted in a particular way. I want to have that discourse with a minimum of normative baggage in any direction. But even given that, I find it necessary to preface my remarks by saying I think on net, feminization has been quite a good thing. It's lowered the chance of war, for instance. It means women have far better job opportunities, which has also big benefits for men, and so on and so on. But it does seem to me, American culture, as with many other wealthy countries, the culture has changed in large part because of feminization. And to just discuss that in a matter-of-fact way is tough to do. So I would like to have more of that discussion. But I don't think we figured it out very well. So I'm not pretending to have all the answers about it. I'm just pretty convinced it's a very significant topic.
As a follow-up to that, it's interesting that you said like feminization has led to like a lower risk of war. Could you like go further and like how do you establish that causally?
Well, I don't know if I can establish it causally, which is hard to do even for simpler questions. But it seems to me there are a fair number of young men who, if the time comes, will fight a war enthusiastically if it is framed for them the right way. Men and women are in this way different. And warrior societies are essentially male societies. Violent drug gangs, which fight mini wars of their own, they are essentially run by men on a particular kind of male macho principle, and that is correlated with violence. And the societies where females are more likely in government or have higher status, such as the Nordic countries, there's just much more of a pro-peace sentiment, a skepticism about violence as a means of solving problems. And again, if you think of women on average as having been physically weaker than men throughout all of history, it shouldn't come as a huge shock that women are more skeptical about violence as a way of solving conflict. They ought to be, they're correct. So that would be my argument. I wouldn't say I've like causally established my claim, but I think it's true.
Yeah, I just couldn't find the right words. Just what indicators, I guess, would have been a better.
Yeah.
I know for sure though that male health outcomes or the fact that there's so many homeless men and so many drug addicted men and men that feel dislocated from the workforce. I feel like that's not talked about enough, and I don't know why.
Probably true, but there's talked about and there's talked about in academia, and they're very different things. So if you went to like a normal middle class, lower middle class community in Indiana, where I have not been lately, to be clear, it's quite possible people there talk about it a lot. I don't know. But we are sampling a pretty narrow sphere of the whole country, living where we live and, being in college and whatever, being professors.
Here's a question that comes from our buddy Diego. Speaking of like men and violence, he's asking, have you thought about the problem of like gang violence and like rampant crime and how to solve it without having like an overbearing police state that might violate liberties?
It's a good question. I mean, how to solve it? I guess it depends where he is talking about.
Oh, he's
located in El Salvador at the moment.
Some of the problems in El Salvador come from the United States. I hardly think we deserve all the blame, but there's a lot of kind of re-importation of both weapons and drug war. So I think in this country, the war on drugs is fundamentally misguided. We ought to change the law and policy so that being a drug gang is not so profitable. I don't think we can have full legalization of drugs in the sense that like Walmart puts the drug gang out of business. The cocaine at Walmart is so much cheaper. Like I could even imagine that's a better world. I just don't think we can ever do it. So in this other sense, maybe you could say I'm not very libertarian. But if you simply have a world where no one goes to jail for drugs, unless it's like forcing them on minors or something. And if Walmart tried to sell drugs, you'd write them a traffic ticket. I'm not sure exactly how to do it. It might be you could deflate the gang somewhat, probably not completely, make them weaker, and then treat drug abuse as a kind of health problem and actually enable people to get treatment with a minimum of legal risk. I'm pretty sure that would be much better than what we have now. I am not so naive to think it would eliminate the gangs. Gangs could switch into other areas. Maybe some of those other areas I would legalize, but they're going to find something. But I think you can take away or limit some of their main revenue sources. Now, what policies should El Salvador do? El Salvador was the first Central American country to industrialize, and they have a history of being more prosperous than their neighbors, which is still somewhat kind of true, Costa Rica aside, but they're at risk of losing that. They've done some market-oriented reforms. They could do much more and just invest more in safety and reliable infrastructure. El Salvador could be a pretty prosperous country, and I actually think it will be someday, but they've been meandering for quite some time now. They could have much better policy.
This is in reference to the very recent interview you did with Nubar IFN, who heads Moderna.
Yes.
As new industries arise, out of interdisciplinary breakthroughs and more useful data is continually gleaned in every sense, what should a college economics department look like today in order to confront actual problems?
It's a very good question. I would say one thing we should do is economics should still yet pay more attention to the economics of healthcare. Now for GMU, I'm not even sure how much of that we offer at the undergraduate level. I know I've never taught it, but whatever it is we're doing, I suspect at the margin we should do more. I know we have offered it. I'm just not sure how much or how often. So I think we're living on the cusp of an era of amazing breakthroughs in the biosciences. mRNA vaccines, if you know their whole story, it is truly incredible. even more so than people realize. The speed, the accuracy, the ability to tweak them, the notion you kind of print them off rather than having to make them more slowly by like growing a virus in an egg. All just incredible, the people who did it. And there's a lot more on the way. There's probably a malaria vaccine coming, CRISPR to cure sickle cell anemia, possible cures of Parkinson's, finally some progress on dementia, Alzheimer's. The idea that an mRNA vaccine might be designed for an individual to cure your cancer, that's mind-boggling. And this was like crazy stuff not long ago. The notion of a pan-coronavirus vaccine that would knock all these out of the park. A lot of this stuff is going to happen, and I don't mean in 40 years. So economists should study it more. But the other point I would make in a very different direction, now that there's all this big data, at least for advanced undergraduates, we should have options of teaching machine learning. Now, it could be we're already doing this through like classes in other departments. Again, I don't myself know, but I suspect at the margin, we should be pushing this more than what we're doing right now.
Mm.
I'm not sure econ should enlist its own machine learning class.
Yeah.
The idea that there's a well set up pipeline to tell people, look, here's the department it's taught in, here's how you do it. Here's how you could convert some of that knowledge back into economics. We could be more proactive on that than what I'm aware of in terms of what we're doing.
Yeah, do you think
along
that's,
those lines,
do you think this possible, a possible boom that would arise from these, these breakthroughs, do you think that's being priced in at all right now?
Boom is a tricky word. I don't think it's a GDP boom. I think it will be an incredible happiness boom. So we're going to get a lot more old people living older, which of course I want for myself and my loved ones. I'm not convinced GDP will look so much phenomenally better. In some ways, it could be worse because we become drains at some point. Still, human welfare will be much higher. We should just go for it. But it won't be like inventing steel or figuring out how to use coal to power factories. GDP is not going to go crazy over those things.
Maybe if we, tap into geothermal energy more, maybe that will bring about, those changes, like you had mentioned, that steel and these very, very physical and tangible things brought about.
We're going to see much cheaper and much cleaner power, pretty much for sure. There's a lot going on in transportation that maybe is not proven, but looking very promising. Things like electric airplanes that, again, a while ago seemed near utopian. Now it's like there might be some in 10 years. I'm not sure how well they'll compete, but it's not absurd to talk about. Driverless cars, slower than we thought for a while, but still probably on the way. Electric cars, really well-functioning, durable batteries for electric vehicle transport. A lot of trucking, will be reshaped by something like driverless vehicles. Again, this is all pretty close all of a sudden.
It's very exciting. I don't think people are considering it enough.
Supersonic, jet transport. Again, I'm not sure it will meet the market test, but there, Boom, the whole company has a high valuation and thinks they can do it. There's a good chance they're right.
What type of trends going into the pandemic do you think will be, when it comes to working remotely and the vacancy rates in San Francisco office spaces right now? What kind of trends do you think are going to be sticky for the next 5 to 10 years as newer technologies like this come into play?
Well, what we're doing right now will be sticky. So 10 years from now, there'll be some version of exactly this event. Presumably Zoom will be better, but it's just so easy to do it over Zoom. And I don't see why we should ever go back. We'll still have live events, but so many events, you'll get someone from California doing this and they're going to do it on Zoom. Mm-hmm. And people who don't go into the office every day will be much, much more common, lasting basically forever. They'll probably live a bit further out. They'll have much lower rent, maybe better schools, more space. longer commute, but they'll do it once or twice a week, and the other days they'll work on Zoom. Seems to me that's totally permanent for a pretty big chunk of people. Not at the median, but like really a pretty big chunk of people.
Kind of building off that, what do you think is the most recent idea that you've come across that could destabilize the status quo?
Well, there's a lot of potential destabilizations. I'm not sure how many of them are new ideas. So there's weapons of mass destruction, right? Biggest risk, not a new idea. Pandemics, again, one of the very oldest of ideas. Environmental problems, one of the very oldest causes of the collapse of civilizations. So maybe if you want a really new idea, like totally decentralized money and finance could break down tax collection. I don't think it will at all. And I think it will end up being a big positive. But just if you're thinking about risks, like that is genuinely a new idea. And a new idea is going to have some risks. You can hide income from the tax man, possibly through crypto, depending exactly how those institutions evolve. Government will try to control crypto, of course, and I'll predict they mostly succeed. But in some visions, like everything goes into a kind of black hole and it's all anonymous crypto and the state doesn't know anything. That's kind of Balaji's view, I think.
Yeah, that's interesting you said, because I always wondered, like, will there be like some exogenous like shock that will like disrupt like the whole state like mechanism as we know it, like maybe with like you said with tax evasion potentially, even though you said like government will probably get hold of it, will there be like a mechanism where like government won't be able to, you know, detect or be able to like see what revenue they can tax? It's interesting.
I mean, here's the thing. I can imagine it being much harder to tax income, or at least some kinds of incomes. But if the government then switches more to taxing land, taxing consumption at the point of purchase, and taxing wealth, I don't like any of that, but they can still tax you other ways.
Right.
And crypto doesn't hide those.
True.
Yeah, decentralization is something that I don't think we can even really wrap our heads around today. You know,
but we have $1 trillion worth of it, right?
Yeah.
Now we're selling these decentralized artworks on the blockchain. That's wild.
Yeah,
May or may not be a fad, but we're starting.
This is actually a question that you know kind of relates to that from one of our club members. Do we need a new theoretical paradigm in economics? It's a very broad question, but
I don't know what that means. I mean, I don't think we're capable of it one way or the other. Like demand curve slope down, mostly. It's not going to change. So what does a new paradigm look like? Well, people should be more sensible. They shouldn't do too much abstract theory. They should study other disciplines more. I mean, I'd agree with all of that. But it's not like a new paradigm. I just think we're a bit past that point.
Kind of similar along those lines. This is a question from our buddy Sahil. What are your thoughts on how economists present ideas and policies to the public? And what do you think the best ways are of communicating economics to like regular people?
Well, it depends on your goal. The golden age of economics blogging is behind us, but I thought that was pretty special. And it educated many millions of people. We still see, you know, the results of that. So myself and Alex aside, most of those people aren't blogging anymore, but a lot of them are doing blog-like things. So maybe what's a blog isn't well defined, but the results of that are still there. Econ Twitter can be pretty good. You know, I'm unhappy with how far to the left my profession has shifted. That would be my main complaint. And I think a lot of people on both sides, left-wing, right-wing, libertarian, whatever, they don't separate out clearly enough the normative from the positive argument. That would be my biggest criticism. But that said, I think economists, compared to other groups of academics, have done this around the best. And if you compare economists, say, to public health types during the pandemic, we have a way more vital, critical, self-reflective set of discussions with more smart people in on it than they do by orders of magnitude.
Mm.
So I think economics has kind of done okay.
Speaking of, do you have any theories on why, like the economist profession specifically has gone so far to the left, I guess, over the last few decades or so?
Well, a tiny bit of it is feminization. That's not the main reason.
Hmm.
But since you brought that up, I'll say it is a factor, maybe factor number 5 or 6. I think the American public has gone more to the left. There's a lot of evidence that's true, at least on economic issues and social issues, right? Foreign policy is harder to say. So people in general have gone to the left. Then you have this thing, I don't like to use the word polarization, but most people would call it polarization, where the educated coastal elites have just become Democrats. And academics are more or less those educated cultural elites. And that pushes them to the left more than the public has moved. And I think that's most of it. And then like feminization is the smaller factor coming in at the end.
Hmm.
Your views have developed over time as well, though. Just about the role of government and public-private, interlocking to confront problems that are as big as we've faced even in the past year. Is there a particular city or an instance of travel abroad that shook your views and changed the way you looked at the relationship between government and private sector?
Well, I became more of a relativist with a number of travel experiences. Two of the biggest ones would be living in Germany when I was 23, and then multiple trips to Singapore, which came a bit later in my life. And it's not that I think America can or should copy either place, but you realize like, hey, each of these places works really well on its own terms. And most people there don't want too big a set of changes. And I just think you need to take that very seriously. And you can have revelations of that kind in other countries. Those were for me both coincidentally 2 places I went to a lot, but there are also 2 places that work pretty well. Like I don't know so many people like who go to Portugal and come away convinced, like Portugal, whatever. Like people maybe they are pretty happy, I'm not sure. But like GDP, other indicators, they're not so great. Like their drug policy, it seems, has worked pretty well. And it's kind of like the policy I advocated for earlier, which, yes, I've learned from. So when you apply that to America, you've got to like ask, what's America good at? What are we bad at? Getting back to test and trace. And just don't try not to double down too hard on things we're bad at or not going to do or do well or will reject like an alien in the body politic. And I think it brings you to a somewhat relativistic stance. And again, I think like literally all of the countries that have done well are capitalistic, like without exception, unless you're counting like a tiny number of petrostates. And even that's kind of a funny, twisted, perverse sort of capitalism. So you don't like become at all anti-capitalistic. You become more pro-capitalism, but you also realize the recipe to get you there is not unique. It's not well defined by any single ideology. You've got to start where you're at and then try to make these beneficial changes at the margin using the market economics you know. I've become much more that.
Mm.
I'd
Yeah.
say there's other issues where I haven't changed my mind, but the events have changed. So for decades, I mean, AIDS was a separate case, but we didn't have what you might call a public pandemic. I think if we had, I would have been fine with the government doing things, but we just didn't have it, right?
Mm-hmm.
I certainly wanted the government to subsidize research into curing or limiting the spread of HIV/AIDS, and that was quite a while ago, but way back then, I did want that. So partly people's views look different because the world agenda itself puts different things before you on the table. But it's not always that a person has changed his or her mind.
Yeah, prior to the pandemic, one thing that I noticed that I felt cities needed more of in America was higher density, especially after spending time in Los Angeles. I mean, even the New York City area could use more density.
Sure.
But now that the pandemic has happened, how has that changed your view on density and YIMBYism and whatnot?
I've been shocked at how poorly density predicts bad outcomes. So 2 of the hardest hit states in the US have been the Dakotas. Obviously not dense. I haven't seen the latest New York numbers, but I think they're somewhere in the middle of the pack. And to the extent they had a big problem, a lot of it was nursing homes, which they did terribly, rather than like the nature of Manhattan. South Korea, Japan, super dense. They've done better than average. Taiwan did better than average by just stopping it before it started, so I wouldn't count that. But maybe the more dense places are better at that too. So it's kind of upped my opinion of density a bit.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I really wanted to touch on that. I feel like density is also something that's not discussed enough in America. I think we could use much more of it. Sorry, go ahead, James.
Oh yeah, I think it's a good time to shift to what we call our culture and lifestyle section of the Q&A. So kick that off by asking, who is your favorite Silicon Valley tech founder and why?
Well, favorite, there's so many that I like a lot. I'll say Patrick and John Collison. Both super smart, incredible readers, deep thinkers, highly ethical in their business. But I think there's so many people you could choose and they would be great picks. I mean, think of Mark Andreessen, who built the browser. Like, what could we do without that? And he was a founder, and he's been since then been a tremendous venture capitalist and a founder of a venture capitalist company. But just like the browser, like how can you beat that? Just am I allowed to say unfucking believable?
Encouraged.
You can do anything you like.
And Facebook, I know people dump on Facebook a lot. I don't spend time on Facebook, the page. I love WhatsApp. I think it's like a perfect system. Instagram is a beautiful page, super well designed, works seamlessly. So there's just a lot of people I could pick.
Yeah, I was reading Paul Graham's blog post the other day about what he's worked on, and his story is incredible. And just constructing the first online shops that people could use to sell, their services or products on is pretty. It's pretty unreal to be involved in something like that.
And I'm writing a book now with venture capitalist Daniel Gross, who is also a founder. Now he's very young and he will be more famous. He's already extraordinarily successful, but he has to go on my list too. And again, that's demonstrated preference. I'm writing a book with him.
When is that book due?
Oh, according to Amazon, it's due sometime in October. I don't know how reliable a predictor that is with the pandemic. A bunch of things have been pushed backwards, but possibly it will be out then. I can't promise it.
That's awesome. That sounds great. Who are you waiting to?
The constraining factor will not be me if it's not out by then. But it could be the accumulation of things working through the queue delays it.
Well, I look forward to that. Who are you waiting to rub elbows with still that you haven't met?
I've never met Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos, and they're both incredible creators. So Amazon, like where do I spend my money? Getting back to demonstrated preference, Amazon and Whole Foods. Like where do I write my books? Daniel Gross. Where do I spend my money? Amazon and Whole Foods. It's got to be worth something. Elon Musk, I was quite skeptical about at first, but clearly I was wrong. And he's made huge advances in multiple areas in a pretty phenomenal manner. I always was a fan of him. I just thought like the world would stop him in the way that like a villain in an Ayn Rand novel, might stop a creator. But it sure seems that he has prevailed.
Do you have a Tesla?
No, I have was a Hyundai Sonata. I agree with Adam Ozimek that you should never spend a lot of money on a car, no matter what. And my last car cost me $19,000, and I feel strongly I will never spend more than that on a car ever, and won't have to.
I'm in complete agreement with you. I drive a very humble car myself, and probably will for the rest of my life. Sorry, go ahead, James, if you had a question.
No, I was just gonna say, yeah, I can't believe, like, I think one of the, you talk about like how consumers in America don't have much savings. It's amazing how willing people are to buy new cars now that you bring that up.
And go into debt. They'll spend 40 to 60K. Presumably these are nice cars. I wouldn't say I am familiar with most of them, but I just don't get it in terms of prioritization.
Yeah.
It's definitely an inefficiency in our society, is the vanity associated with these purchases.
But again, maybe we also need to understand the buyers more deeply. So they may be lacking in other sources of vanity, and this maybe is quite important to them. I don't know. I would like to understand it better.
Well, maybe one day you can get a Tesla and experience the electric drivetrain, which I've heard cool things about. But when the price comes down, oh, you have?
I've tried them out. I am familiar with it. Frankly, it terrified me, but I blame that on me, not on the product. But I don't think I'll ever, if I'm like old and infirm and I can't drive, but sort of the normal me as I know it, is not going to go for the self-driving thing.
Oh, yeah.
And I do trust the technology. I just don't feel at ease with it because of my own programming.
Fair enough. It's kind of pivoting, but who do you think is an economist that is overrated and then one that is underrated?
You mean from the whole history of economics? I would say Paul Samuelson is overrated. A lot of his models haven't held up that well. He was quite arrogant. He's certainly one of the 10 greatest economists of his century, but he's near the bottom of that list of 10, not near the top. For underrated, I think Pigou and Edgeworth in History of Economic Thought are grossly underrated. Malthus is underrated. People think he was some kind of pessimist crank who had no notion of Julian Simon or the Industrial Revolution. None of that is really the right way to read him. John Stuart Mill is very underrated. Most of them are underrated, I think, especially the classical economists. I think they understood supply and demand better than a superficial reading might indicate. These people who think, oh, it was all the labor theory of value, that's not really right in my view. But many underrated. I think Kenneth Arrow is becoming underrated. I'm not sure he was 15, 20 years ago, but he's one of the very best of his century. And I just feel he's a bit lost to the mists of memory now. Same with Gary Becker. He's not read so much anymore. And just an incredible force and figure and thinker and commentator on the work of others. Kevin Murphy, maybe like the greatest living microeconomist. He has to be underrated.
Yeah, it's interesting. You mentioned Malthus. I always find Malthus interesting. People are always like, "Hey, can you believe this guy thought this?" Like it's kind of like how they treat him. But I think the Malthusian Trap is honestly one of the most amazing economic concepts I've learned. Even though obviously we're out of it with the hockey stick of growth, but still I thought the Malthusian Trap was amazing for its time, no question.
But even moving beyond that, so the Crude Malthus is the first edition, 1798. By the time you get to the third edition of 1803, he sees that growth is possible as a way out of the trap, but he's also asking at what moral cost will this come? And again, it's just much more sophisticated in terms of trade-offs than most people realize. He was not some mega pessimist. And there's a written exchange. Read the letters between Malthus and Senior, Nassau Senior, who was the big free market, pro-progress libertarian. He writes a letter apologizing to Malthus for having claimed he was a doom and gloom pessimist, and that now he sees oh, I don't agree with you, Mr. Malthus, but I see now how your system is set up. And Malthus thanks him for making this concession. You read that, it really opens people's eyes.
What's the field of study today that you think is over and underrated?
You mean in economics?
No, not within economics, just generally speaking. Things that you don't think we should be studying, things that you think we should really very much be prioritizing.
Again, I'm not sure I'm qualified to give much of a big picture judgment. I would note this.
Economics.
When I talk to talented young people, I see large numbers of them going into computational biology. And I think as the biosciences are blooming, that will continue to do amazing things. And those kids don't underrate it, but I think outsiders underrate computational biology rather grossly. Overrated, and again, I'm not even sure how these things are rated, but maybe theoretical physics. It seems at a dead end, needs some kind of big breakthrough. I have no idea how far it is from one, but the possibility that when it comes to like integrating Einstein, quantum mechanics, theory of quantum gravity, how does all this fit together? Like the actual answer might be there is no answer. And people maybe are worrying about that a bit more. And that would kind of doom at least some parts of the science, not the people in physics like working on materials and other topics or black holes, but some parts of theoretical physics maybe just won't get much further.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. With all the hubbub around some of these second and third tier cities in America that all these founders and these amazing minds are moving to these days, and the talks of New York and it's what it'll look like, and how Los Angeles has changed a lot since the pandemic started. What city are you most bullish on and least bullish on after the pandemic?
Again, it depends on your metric, but I think what most cities will look like after the pandemic for most cities is already clear, and you see it now. So a place like Nashville doing well, it's already doing well. It'll continue to do well. The two big question marks to me are New York and San Francisco. I worry about those skyscraper elevators in New York that even a quite vaccinated population might feel nervous about getting in with 10 people each trip up or down. It could be there's a future for New York where it's more like the Berlin of 15 years ago, younger, cheaper, stinkier, in some ways more fun, at least for young people, but not the kind of place where you would think like any Joe Schmo from Ohio can just go live there and feel at home. So it might go back to how it was in the 80s and 90s. I think that would be my prediction, but with a high degree of uncertainty. San Francisco, I tend to think won't really come back. Too much bad publicity. School system made some awful mistakes, which even if they're fixed, the bad PR will remain. High taxes, too much wokeism, crime out of control. The government doesn't seem to want to govern. But I'm still very optimistic about everything surrounding San Francisco. I just think things will move out of what was already actually a somewhat smallish city, and they'll just be nearby. May not change the big picture story very much, but I guess I'm pretty bearish on the physical limits of the city of San Francisco. I don't see why people would want to do things there at this point or live there.
I think we'd be remiss if we didn't ask a question about ethnic food and cuisine. What do you sticking to the over and underrated theme? What do you think is an over and underrated ethnic dish, at least in your taste?
Well, I think the underrated cuisine right now, this will sound crazy, but is Chinese. And I mean Chinese regional. And we have two incredible new places in Fairfax. One is Yu's Garden, which is near Nanjing Bistro in the same strip mall. And the other is Mim's, which is next to Curry Mantra, super near campus. That's Xinjiang food. And they have just amazing dishes. And I don't know, no one tells me about them, so they must be underrated, right?
Yeah.
Now, what's overrated? I don't know. I guess I think a lot of Korean food in Annandale isn't quite as good as it should be. And I've been to Korea many times. I love Korean food. I think like it's all okay, some good dishes, but it's a little disappointing to me. And I think people around here have this kind of macho attitude, like we've got real Korean food. I don't know. It's like pretty good, but I'd say it's become a bit overrated.
So to round this off, what is the Tyler Cowen production function?
Well, I would say a mix of curiosity, obsessiveness, ability to read super fast, a willingness to travel. And as I said in the blog post this morning, the sense of, I'm going to try to do things. Let's make people tell me no. It's not all of it, but those are like some immediate pieces that come to mind.
That's good.
And your thoughts on decoding culture too are always, very important as well, especially to the field of economics. Your emphasis on culture is amazing and admirable.
That I learned when I lived in Germany, going back to your earlier question of like what other countries had a big impact on me. That year I spent living in Germany was the best intellectual year of my life because I got to see so many new countries.
Right. All right. Well, Dr. Cowen, thank you so much for joining us. This was really awesome. It's a privilege to have, like I said, the face of our department talk with us undergrads. It's really an awesome experience.
I appreciate you having me on. If I can help any of you out with anything, at least try me. I can't promise, but I do take that notion seriously. And once you have a link for this, please let me know.
We'll be sure to. All right.
Okay,
Thank you.
look forward to our next in-person meeting whenever.
Yeah, hopefully.
Definitely.
Okay,
Thank
take
you.
care.
Take care.
Bye.
Much obliged. Thank you.